Hi everyone, and a warm welcome to today's session, Free Furlough Facts, by HR and employment law expert Rob Tice. My name's Paula Prescott and I'm Senior Relationship Manager here at SR Education. SR Education are a national apprenticeship training provider covering apprenticeships in some of the most common business functions. This includes team leading, management, business skills, customer service and sales, international freight forwarding, supply chain logistics, digital marketing, HR and L&D. Alongside this, we offer information, advice and guidance on a variety of areas to our employers, including apprenticeship planning and funding, employment queries, safeguarding and most recently furlough. This leads me nicely on to why we thought now would be a good time to offer an information session from an expert. So I'm now going to hand over to Rob to introduce himself. So thank you, Rob, and over to you.
And then there is myself and my business. I'm going to be the speaker for the webinar. So just a brief bit of background about me. My business is called BMC Precept. We are employment law and HR specialists. We look after businesses of all shapes and sizes and in all different kind of sectors, primarily focusing on HR and employment law advice and training as well. My personal background is I've been an employment lawyer for just over 20 years now. So again, seen all different kinds of scenarios in the employment law and HR world. We're focusing today on furlough. And before we, in terms of structure that we're going to look at today, we're going to look at a couple of things. We're going to look at the background. So it's probably helpful at this point now just to recap on where we've come from and where we've got to. And then the second part is going to focus on questions that I've been asked over these last few weeks, these challenging weeks, let's be honest, because this furlough scheme has been hard work. And I figured that if these questions have been asked by clients, and so I figure if they're relevant to them, then they're going to be relevant to you. And what I hope from today is that you will leave with a few things. Firstly, hopefully you'll learn new things and things that you hadn't seen before. It may be that you have seen them, but it just acts as a bit of a sanity check and pulls everything together in terms of where we've got to so far. So next step is we'll move on to look at the background scenario. So let's just recap in terms of where we've got to with the furlough scheme. It's called the Coronavirus Job Retention Scheme. We're all familiar with that now, the CJRS. And we also know that the scheme was introduced to help employers keep people, basically. So when the coronavirus hit the country and lockdown started, businesses of all shapes and sizes in all types of sectors were hit very hard. And in the ordinary course of events, pretty much your only remedy is you either lay off if you can, but of course that means the employees don't get paid, or you make them redundant. But that has huge consequences for the business, and it has huge consequences for the economy. And so this scheme was created, and it introduced the concept of furlough. Furlough was not something we'd seen before in English law. It is common in America, but not here. And basically what furlough does is it introduces the idea that the employee doesn't work, so they don't come to work, they don't do any work, but they're not dismissed. So they remain in your employment, and the government, as the fourth bullet point there, essentially reimburses the employer for reduced pay. And we know that it's well known now that it's either the lower of 80% of their wage costs, of the employee's wage costs, or £2,500 per calendar month. Employer can also recover their employer's NI contributions and the employer's auto-enrolment pension contributions on the actual furlough pay itself. Final bits on background. The scheme, when it was introduced, it was backdated to the 1st of March. The scheme was due to run until the end of May, but we now know it's due to run until the end of June. At the point we're recording this at the end of April. So We know at this current time it's due to run out at the end of June, although that could change. We don't know what's going to happen yet. I haven't seen anything that extends it yet, but we'll watch out. We also know that the HMRC portal, which is to make the actual claim itself, opened on the 20th of April. And of course, we'll be starting to see how that process has worked. They were saying that they're expecting payments to be made within 6 days. Probably a bit longer in the first wave, but we should be starting to see payments come through. So it'll be interesting to see what feedback you guys are getting in terms of how the portal has functioned. So now into the presentation. Let's firstly look at who is covered by the scheme. Basically, it's all employees or workers. So it doesn't matter if they're part-time or full-time, they'll be covered by the scheme. There was a provision that it was only employees who were basically on your payroll as of the 28th of February 2020. That was changed because there was a bit of hoo-ha as people had, new people had joined, employers had taken them on. So it didn't seem very fair that that was this arbitrary cut-off date. So they changed that to the 19th of March 2020. But there is one very important condition, that the employer had to be on the employer's payroll, and the real-time information had to have been submitted to HMRC with the employee's details on it. And if they weren't and haven't been, then that employer unfortunately won't qualify. Also, some clarification just come out recently that non-UK nationals can be furloughed by a UK employer, and the grants under the scheme are not counted as access to public funds, and an employer can furlough employees on all categories of visa. So there's some helpful clarification there. Then let's have a look at what can be relied on as an employee's consent to be furloughed. So let's just look at the slide first. So for the purposes of the CGRS, an employee is a furloughed employee if we've got the following. They've been instructed and agreed in writing to cease all work in relation to their employment. They cease that work for a minimum period of 21 days or 3 weeks. And they have been instructed to cease work by reason of circumstances arising in consequence of COVID-19. There's a couple of important points we can take out of this. One is that the scheme, interestingly, it's not about redundancy, the employee being at risk of redundancy. It's that third point. The furlough scheme applies where it's circumstances arising in consequence of COVID-19, so a wider definition. But also there's this first point about how does this furlough scheme operate around employee consent and records. And interestingly, it probably help at this point just to say that as the scheme has evolved, the initial scheme came out, and then HMRC have issued guidance. So the guidance has gradually clarified questions that have arisen how the scheme operates. And in a sense, that's been helpful because it's answered questions that we weren't sure on. However, as well as HMRC's guidance, there is also what's called a Treasury direction, which has come straight from the Treasury Department. And so we have these two things happening. Ultimately, we're told that the Treasury direction will be the prevailing thing. So in other words, what they say will be what will happen. But of course, we also have the guidance which talks about how HMRC will implement. The problem is that there has been a bit of conflict sometimes between the guidance and the Treasury direction. And you'll see a bit of that as we go through the webinar. But it's important, just so you probably heard these terms, but it's HMRC guidance and Treasury, the Treasury direction. They're important because I'll refer to them as we go through it. Now here, this is relevant because initially when the scheme came out, there wasn't provision around, how did you furlough and so on. But then, of course, that's developed. Now, what we have is that the Treasury direction basically says that you have to have the employee's agreement to furlough. That's the first thing. It should be in writing, and you should have the written agreement from the employee. Now, the guidance slightly differs because that suggests you don't need to have the employee's written agreement. Our advice is, if you're doing this, make sure you get the employee's written agreement. And that's important for two reasons. One is to make sure that you qualify for the furlough scheme and you get your reimbursement. And secondly, as importantly, remember that the furlough scheme, whilst you're claiming money from the government, it's still a variation of contract with the employee. Hence the reason that you need their agreement to make the change, because even though they're still getting paid, it's still a reduction in salary. So you need their agreement, and you would want that agreement to be in writing anyway. Because if you can't prove that agreement, then technically they could start arguing they didn't agree, and therefore you're unlawfully deducting from their wages. So, in summary, to qualify for the furlough reimbursement and to ensure that the variation has been done properly, the advice is make sure you set out the terms of the furlough very clearly in a short letter's fine, confirming it varies the contract, for how long, when it changes, and so on. So setting out basically the terms for the furlough scheme, and ask the employee to sign it and make sure they've agreed. Next issue is, what records should an employer keep in relation to employees on furlough? And this has all been clarified, so we can set out pretty clearly what you need to do. In a nutshell, you've got to keep a written record of all the communications with the employee in terms of the furlough arrangement, the furlough agreement that you have with them, and you've got to keep that information for 5 years. You should also keep all your copies of your claims for reimbursement that you make for the furloughed employees' wages, and also keep all of your keep records of the training undertaken by those individuals. And we'll come on to training a little bit later in the webinar. Next, how does an employer decide who to put onto furlough? Now, to some degree, I guess most of us have probably furloughed the people we want to furlough, but there will be other issues. There might be some of you who haven't yet furloughed anyone. There might be some of you who haven't furloughed all of your staff, considering further furloughs, or you might be looking to rotate, which we'll look at in a bit. So I think this is important. How do you decide who to put onto furlough? And there's a few options. The first is that you seek volunteers. I'm not a massive fan of that. I think it's a bit equivalent to redundancy volunteers sometimes. You either get too many or you get the wrong people volunteering. So, but it's an option if you want to look at it. The second option is where it's really, really urgent. And I think that was more relevant when the scheme first came out. There was some acceptance that it probably wouldn't be perfect, and you might be judged slightly less strictly in terms of how you go about it. But otherwise, really, the fairest way to do it, and the way to reduce risk, is you use a selection matrix. Now, you might not necessarily give that to employees, but it's just being able to justify why you have picked people to either be furloughed or to be not furloughed. And it's important to say, because what we are now seeing from our clients is that there's a mixed reaction to people being furloughed and not being furloughed. The ones who are furloughed are probably wanting to start to come back because they're getting bored at home and they're seeing a reduction in pay. Equally, ones who are being furloughed are working really hard. So they might welcome some time away, even though that their pay is reduced. So it's both sides, and it's just making sure it's fair. So a selection matrix is the best way to do it. It avoids two issues, one I put on the slide and one extra one. The first is discrimination, so we don't want there to be any argument that someone has been furloughed or not furloughed because of a protected characteristic. So if it's a fair, selection way of doing things, then that's going to be fine. And also, of course, there is what's called the implied term of trust and confidence. So basically, we as employer have to maintain trust and confidence between us and the employee. If we fundamentally break that trust and confidence, potentially we break the contract and get into constructive dismissal issues. So I think it is important, again, that this is done fairly to avoid any inference that potentially we've damaged or even broken the employment relationship. So we touched on this a minute ago. Can an employer rotate furlough between its employees? Simple answer is yes, you can. Things to think about are that, of course, your minimum furlough period must be 3 weeks. So that's the first thing you've got to bear in mind. The guidance says that employees can be furloughed multiple times as long as the minimum consecutive 3-week period finishes. So, it could be somebody is furloughed for 3 weeks, they come back into work, they're re-furloughed, but the key thing is to make sure if you re-furlough, that furlough period is a minimum of 3 weeks in order to qualify for the reimbursement. Next, is there a specific amount of time an employee has to work before going back on furlough? Now, we haven't seen anything on this that suggests that, let's think this through. So we bring somebody's furloughed and we bring them back, and then we decide to re-furlough them again. So we're rotating. So this is about that bit in the middle where they come back off furlough before they go back. Is there a minimum period that it has to be whilst they're back at work? And so far we haven't seen anything that says that it does have to be for a minimum period. The only thing that does spring to mind is that second point on the slide, is that, if you are rotating, logically, it'll probably will be 3 weeks on and 3 weeks off, but it doesn't have to be. Can an employee be furloughed for a period that is not a multiple of 3 weeks? So why is this important? I was asked this question the other day. Let's say you've done your first furlough and they've now been furloughed for 4 or 5 weeks. Do you have to wait until you get to 2 complete blocks of 3 weeks before you can unfurlough them? And basically, I think the answer flows in this logic. One is that the guidance says furlough has to be a minimum period of 3 weeks, consecutive weeks, but it doesn't say that there has to then be blocks of 3 weeks. So our advice is that as long as you've got the minimum 3-week period in for furlough, you can then let that run on, and then if you decide to bring them back, it wouldn't matter if they've been furloughed for 4 weeks or 5 weeks. Next, can an employee request their employer puts them onto furlough? Answer is they can request it, but you don't have to agree. It is your decision as to whether you place someone on furlough, if at all. And I think that is important because that question has arisen a few times where employees are coming to the employer and asking to be furloughed. It is your decision. Are employers obliged to top up the remaining 20%? The answer is you are entitled. You can, if you choose to. So you are allowed to top it up, but you are not obliged to. You only have to comply with the minimum that the scheme has set out. But remember that if you do top up, then any additional national insurance contributions or auto enrolment contributions you won't be able to claim back. You can only claim back the amounts on the actual cap itself. Can an employee work for another employer? Answer is they can. That's allowed under the scheme. But what they can't do is you can't, if you're the employer, what you can't do is ask them to go and work for another linked or associated business. That's only recently come out. So it has to be somebody who's completely separate to your business. Can employees with more than one employer be furloughed? Been asked that a few times. Answer is that they can. So an employee can be furloughed by one employer, continue to work for the other, or they can be furloughed by both employers, and the scheme essentially will pay out for each job. Next is furlough and sick pay. This one's been a bit of a head scratcher, I have to say, but there has been a bit of clarification on this recently. And essentially it sets out that if the employee was off sick when furlough started and the SSP entitlement is in play, is ongoing, then the furlough scheme will not apply until the SSP entitlement period has ended. Where it slightly differs is if they're already on furlough and then become sick, that it suggests that the employer is allowed then to choose, basically. So you can either have them on furlough or place them on sick, but you are allowed to continue with furlough. Can employees who have childcare responsibilities be on furlough? I was asked this question recently. Essentially, the person involved was busy, so they had work to do, but they had childcare responsibilities. There is provision in the guidance for this that allows an employer to furlough where the childcare responsibilities arise out of the COVID-19 situation. The only exception to that is part 2 of that slide, where if somebody's on unpaid leave before the 28th of February, you can't furlough them until the agreed date of their return. So in other words, when they originally agreed to come back, you can't furlough them until that point. Can employees on furlough do volunteer work? The answer is they can. The only thing they've made very clear is that what employers can't do is furlough somebody and then get them doing voluntary work within their business, because that would be circumventing the scheme. So if they can do voluntary work, but it's got to be completely unconnected with the employer, basically. Can employees on furlough undertake training? They can, so employees are allowed to undertake training. Again, a little bit of conflict between the guidance and the Treasury direction. So the guidance says that training can take place, provided it is not used by the employer to generate revenue or for the provision of services. So again, circumventing furlough. So quite wide there. Treasury direction is a bit more narrow, a bit more limited. And that says basically the employee should not work at all, with the exception being training, when the training activities are directly relevant to the employee's employment. So basic advice is ensure that if they are going on any training, make sure that their training is, pretty bob on, relevant to the employment that they do. Also, if they're doing training, you've got to ensure that they're getting at least the national minimum wage. Next is, how do you keep in touch with employees on furlough? And this is just something to keep an eye on, because of course, these are difficult times, everything's moving very quickly, and the temptation is just furlough everyone and then forget about them. And that's really, we've got to keep one eye on the future here. Got to keep our eye on people's well-being. We've got to keep an eye on their return and how they're going to be integrated back into the business when they come back in. So very, very important. And some tips here are, firstly, have a think what you would normally do. So if someone's on maternity leave or paternity leave, what would you normally do to keep in touch with those people? I would agree, ideally, with the employee before they're furloughed. Make sure you've got the up-to-date contact details. Where can you email? Is it private? Are they happy for you to do that? And so on. Phone numbers, etc. A good point is that just be careful with excessive communication. There is a balance, isn't there? We want to communicate with our employees, but if you're overdoing it, then we might stray into they're actually working again situation, which they shouldn't be doing. So it is a balance. Informing of developments, say, on a weekly basis maybe by an email is fine. I know somebody, very experienced HR professional who they're ringing the furloughed employees once a week just to touch in and see how they're getting on, make sure they're okay, deal with any questions or worries that they might have. And that's absolutely fine and really good HR practice. Also, just think about vulnerable employees, so people with disabilities and so on, perhaps mental health impairments. There I think we will be able to go that further mile, because that's a perfectly good, reasonable adjustment for those people. Are employees who transferred under TUPE on or before 19 March 2020 eligible for furlough? Answer is yes. Some issue around that short window in March, because they should be on your payroll, of course, and RTI information submitted. So I have seen some comment that potentially that might be a problem, because of course they'll be new to your payroll. It seems a bit unfair when TUPE is designed to operate as if they'd always been employed by you, but it could potentially be a pitfall. But in a nutshell, TUPE is designed to be covered. The guidance suggests it's only business transfers at the moment and not service provision change, but we'll see if there's further guidance on that. Will employees continue to accrue holiday during furlough? The guidance has made very clear, yes, they do. They continue to accrue holiday. If the worker employee doesn't take annual leave in the relevant leave year because they're on furlough, can they carry it forward to the next leave year? Now, this holiday, just worth breaking it down, how holiday entitlement is structured. Initially, the first 4 weeks is actually given by the European directive, European law. It's been implemented by the working time regulations, but essentially the first 4 weeks, ordinarily, you are not allowed to carry it over under any circumstances. There's been an amendment to the legislation to say that if the person has to carry it forward as a result of the effects of the coronavirus, and that includes on the worker, the employer, or the wider economy or society, then they'll be allowed to carry those 4 weeks forward into the next 2 leave years. And what that's really designed for is where an employer may be in a key service, they can't let people take holiday because they've got to have all their people there. That's what that's designed for. The additional 1.6 weeks, which is given by the working time regulations, that can be carried forward by a year under, as long as there's a relevant agreement. That's under existing law. And then anything over and above that would be contractual, and you would look at the contract to see how that is governed. Can annual leave be taken during furlough? Now, this was a problem for a while, actually. Nobody really was quite sure whether you could or you couldn't. There was some initial speculation that if somebody took holiday during furlough, that it broke the furlough period, which of course was a serious problem. But that's been clarified now. It's perfectly reasonable to take holiday during the furlough period. Of course, if they do take holiday, then it's very important that it's very clear, that you have to top the pay up. So basically, they get normal pay for that period. And there's mixed feelings on this, I think, and with carryover and holiday, I think some employers may take the view that actually they can't afford to top it up. Others, and I have seen a lot of this, are actually more worried about a holiday accruing and piling up. Which actually brings us neatly onto our next point, which is that can you require a worker to take holiday during furlough? Now, what I have seen quite a lot of already is employers are starting to ask their employees to take their holiday, and that's absolutely fine. This is a step further. Can you insist on them taking holiday during the furlough period? Well, under ordinary circumstances, the answer is yes. The working time regulations make it clear that if you want someone to take holiday, you simply give twice the amount of notice of the holiday for them to take it. So, example, you want somebody to take 5 days holiday, you would have to give them 10 days notice. The only thing I've seen on that, and I don't think it is a problem, but it's worth just mentioning, is that there could be some argument that during a period of lockdown, can the employee enjoy rest and relaxation, which is what holiday is designed for, during a lockdown? Now, on the basis you can exercise and you can relax at home, that seems pretty reasonable. Somebody could raise that, I suppose, but on balance, I have to say my view is I think it's perfectly reasonable for the employer to insist on people taking holiday. It's a good business decision, probably in some cases as well. Will it be an unfair dismissal if an employer makes someone redundant rather than placing them on furlough? A difficult question to determine, really. Difficult to judge how a tribunal would view it. Easiest way is to go back to general principles of fairness for unfair dismissal claims. So it's a test of reasonableness. You look at the size and resources of the employer. Gut feeling says that because you can recover under the furlough scheme, as long as the employee has agreed, the sensible thing to do is probably hang on. The reality is now a lot of employers are starting to look ahead, anticipating the scheme ending at the end of June, possibly only a short while longer, even if it gets extended, and anticipating that they may have to make redundancies. So it's fine to plan for them now and fine to start that process during furlough, but maybe timing it so that the conclusion might come near the end of the furlough scheme. So thoughts are okay to start planning, probably don't start them until nearer the end of the scheme would be probably the sensible thing to do, unless you financially were forced into that position and you didn't have a choice.
So that concludes today's webinar. Thank you so much, Rob, for a really informative session. Hopefully everybody found this really useful and answered all your questions that you had. If there are any further questions, comments, anything else that you'd like to add, please don't hesitate to get in contact with me. My contact details are on the presentation. But until then, everybody, thank you again for your time. Stay safe and take care.